Hello everyone, my name is Kitty and I'm here today to share with you how I made this dress. Now this dress features a fully elasticated bodice and pointed front. And you can find the pattern for this dress available for download in my Etsy shop. Now as you can see, I have made this dress in two colorways. I have made it in the purple and the green. Now the purple colorway is made out of a lightweight cotton and the green is made out of a heavier cotton blend. I did find that adding the elastic was a little bit easier for the purple and the lightweight cotton, but you can make this dress out of a variety of fabrics. Just please keep in mind that this dress does require a lot of fabric. You will be needing between 6 and 7 meters depending on what size you cut out. And this is because this dress features a long and full circle skirt, and that's what's going to be eating the bulk of your fabric. But I do think it's worth it because you get this gorgeous twirly princess skirt. Now you may find the way I add elastic to be a little unusual. I like to cut an outer and lining layer, sew them together to create elastic channels, and then insert the elastic. You may prefer elastic thread, and if you opt for this method, you do not need to cut out a lining layer. And like I said, the pattern is available in my Etsy shop, and I'm really excited to share this process with you. So let's get started. The materials I am using for this dress are 6.5 yards or 6 meters of lavender lightweight cotton. I'm using about 6 meters to make a size medium dress. You may want a little more fabric if you're making a larger size. I'm also using a light pink thread since I didn't have a matching lavender thread on hand, and I'm using about 20 meters of 6mm wide elastic. The pattern for this dress is available in my Etsy shop. It is a downloadable PDF and is available in either A4 or US letter size. Make sure to print it at the correct size and at 100% scale. After printing, check the measurements on the first page using a ruler, and if everything looks good, you can start assembling the pattern. The pattern will make a grid that is 8 pages wide, and you can trim the margins as needed when assembling. But please be warned that this pattern is a little large to accommodate the pointed circle skirt. After assembling the pattern, you can cut the pattern to your size. I am cutting my pattern to a size medium. Next, I opened up my fabric to the full width and then folded it on itself. You need to first open up the fabric to its full width to accommodate the large pattern pieces for the circle skirt. You will have 2 pattern pieces for your circle skirt, and both pattern pieces need to be cut on a fold, since each pattern piece for the circle skirt, when cut on the fold, will make up 1/2 of the circle skirt. 1/2 of the circle skirt is the front half and has a pointed top edge to accommodate the pointed front on the front portion of your bodice. The other half of your circle skirt has a rounded top edge to accommodate the back half of your bodice. In the PDF pattern, I have included full pattern pieces for your skirt, so cutting it out should be very easy for you. Next, I used the leftover fabric from my skirt to cut out my sleeves, and then I cut out my bodice front and back on my remaining fabric. And now you should have all of your pieces cut out, which will include 2 bodice front pieces cut on the fold, 2 bodice back pieces cut on the fold, 2 sleeve pieces cut on the fold, 1 skirt back piece cut on the fold, 1 skirt front piece cut on the fold. With everything cut out, we can start sewing. I like to start by sewing the front of my bodice to the back of my bodice on one edge. I match pretty sides together and then straight stitch. I go back and finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch to prevent any fraying. And then I top stitch the seam allowance down. I like to top stitch the seam allowance down because it makes adding the elastic to my bodice easier later. Repeat these steps for the front and back of your bodice lining. Now the bodice will make a pretty long rectangle, but here you can see what it looks like the front and back joined together on just one side. Next, with the pretty sides touching, or the right sides touching, match the outer layer of your bodice to the bodice lining. Take care to match the straight top edges together. We will next be sewing the bodice outer layer to the bodice lining, and you will only be sewing along the two straight top edges. You should not sew the small triangle divot. That is where you will be adding sleeves later, and right now we want these edges on the triangle unsewn so that we can insert elastic. So again, just sew along the two top straight edges. Now you can fold your bodice piece over on the edge we just stitched. I then like to press this edge to make it extra crisp. And here is what your bodice should look like so far. The front has been sewn to the back on one side. The bodice has been sewn to the lining on the two top edges, then folded over and pressed, and that triangle divot for the armhole remains unsewn. Now we can start sewing the elastic channels into the bodice. The elastic is what will give the bodice the bulk of its shaping and fit. And I like this method of adding elastic since I find it very sturdy, and it often means you can get away without wearing a bra when wearing this style of dress. And it also means you don't have to wind any bobbins with elastic. These are all big pluses for me. However, you can opt for elastic thread instead of this shown method, but you will want to make the bodice with only one layer of fabric, since this method takes two layers, the bodice outer layer and the lining, to sandwich the elastic in between when creating the channels. For this method, I sew multiple straight lines horizontally across the bodice. I sew each channel far enough from the previous row of stitching so that I can feed my elastic in the space between the lines of stitches. You may want to use a ruler and chalk or a water-soluble pin to mark where you want to sew the lines. I, however, just used the side of the foot of my machine to measure and space out my lines of stitching. As you can see, I just create multiple lines of stitching. I do have to stop and start the stitches at that little triangle divot, but once I go beneath that triangle divot, I can just sew straight across horizontally the bodice. Another thing you may be able to see is how the right side of the foot of my machine runs along my previous straight row of stitches. This is how I measure the distance between my rows of lines. But what really matters is that you make fairly even channels that are not so tight you can't feed your elastic through the channels, nor so loose that the elastic is basically swimming in there. And you're just going to make a whole bunch of straight lines sewing across your bodice. Even as you reach the bottom and the point, just keep sewing straight across. Sew across until it's completely covered. And here is what your bodice will look like once you have all of your lines sewn in. Go ahead and take a moment to clean up your edges and trim your loose threads. We are now at a crucial but forgiving point in making the bodice for our dress, and that is adding elastic. Now, because most of the shaping comes from the elastic inserted into the channels, You can always go back and pull the elastic a little bit tighter to create a more snug fit to your bodice. And I will be talking about how I measure and cut my elastic pieces for the bodice, but I do want to first warn you that this portion can be a bit time consuming and a bit tedious since there are a lot of elastic channels that need elastic cut for it and then inserted. So definitely put on a good audiobook or a TV show in the background to help you work through this dull portion. But otherwise, I'm going to now talk about cutting and measuring the elastic, so let's keep going. So now we want to get this big wonky bodice we've created shaped to fit us. There are a few ways to go about measuring and cutting the elastic for each channel. One way is to wrap the elastic around the place you need it, pull it a little bit tighter, and then cut it. So for example, if you need elastic for a channel at your bust, wrap the elastic around your bust, pull it an inch or two tight, and then cut it. You would be basically eyeball measuring and cutting as you go. However, there is another way that I think is pretty forgiving, and it is the way I prefer to cut my elastic. So I'll tell you how I do it. So what I like to do is take my measuring tape and measure around the smallest part of my waist. Then I take that measurement and subtract 2 inches or 5 centimeters. So for example, my waist is 30 inches and I subtract 2 inches, which leaves me with 28 inches. Now I take a piece of elastic that is 28 inches long and I check to make sure it will fit over the widest part of my bust comfortably. If my 28-inch long piece of elastic fits over the widest portion of my bust, then I know that I can use a 28-inch piece of elastic for every elastic channel on my bodice. And please don't worry, if this was a little confusing to you, I will put a chart in the PDF pattern for the recommended length you should cut your elastic to. These were just some alternative options in case you wanted to customize or change your elastic length. So now I know all my elastic pieces will be each cut to 28 inches long, with one small exception. The elastic on the top few inches of my bodice will have to be cut in half, from 28 inches to 14. This is to accommodate the triangle armholes that sort of cut into the top edge of the bodice. So now I cut my elastic to the appropriate length, 28 inches if it's fully across the bodice, or 14 inches if it's just across half of the bodice. And then I put those elastic pieces on a bobby pin and thread them through the elastic channels. I use safety pins to secure the elastic on either end of the elastic channel, and I do a couple rows of elastic before going back and stitching the edges in place with my machine. So here you can see I've added several rows of 14-inch elastic to the front half of my bodice, and now I'm going to add several rows of 14-inch elastic to the back half of my bodice. Once all the rows of 14-inch elastic have been added, I can move on and start adding my 28-inch elastic across the full width of the bodice. I like to work on the elastic from the top of my bodice down. Here you can see both sides have their 14-inch elastic added, and now I'm going to start adding the 28-inch long elastic across the full width of the bodice. Again, this portion can be a bit time consuming, a bit tedious, a bit boring, so definitely put on an audiobook or something just to help you work. But I promise the results look very nice once you're finished. So I basically just poke my elastic piece onto a bobby pin, and then I feed that bobby pin through the elastic channel. I like to sort of stretch out that bodice piece as I'm working and stretch out the elastic as I feed it through. And I make sure to secure both ends with a safety pin. That way I don't lose one side of the elastic piece in the channel. And again, you just have to keep working and feeding that bobby pin through. You can, of course, opt for a safety pin, but my fear is that a safety pin may come open while you're feeding it through the channel, which could be a huge pain trying to get that safety pin out of the channel once it's in there. Alright, and at long last, I finally have all of my 28-inch long elastic added. All that's left to do is add the elastic to the elastic channels that will make up the front point of the bodice. Now this is really simple since your bodice should mostly be shaped at this point. I just lie my elastic on top of the bodice and sort of eyeball measure how long I want that piece of elastic to be. Then I just thread it through the channel. There's really no trick or anything magical about this to figure out the measurement. Again, I just lie the elastic on top of the bodice, which should already be pretty much shaped, and then cut it to the approximate length that I think I want it to be. And here are my last few rows of elastic, which create the front point to my bodice, and I have the edges secured with safety pins. Now I'm just going to very carefully stitch those edges, stitch that elastic in place, and then I'm going to trim up all my crazy edges and trim off any little extra dangling elastic and threads, just cleaning it up a bit. Okay, now we can set your bodice piece aside and start working on your two sleeves. I like to start by folding my sleeve in half and then cutting 4 pieces of elastic that are just as long as the top and bottom edges of your sleeve. Next, on the top edge of your sleeve, you're going to fold it over 2 times and top stitch it down. This will create a channel for elastic and hide the raw edge. So be sure to create this channel wide enough so that you're able to insert your piece of elastic later. Again, all you're going to do is fold that top raw edge under 1 time so that it's hidden, and a 2nd time so that you can create the elastic channel. Now you're just going to stitch along that side edge to secure that elastic channel. Next, you're going to sew the sides of your sleeve together. And remember, you are not sewing that little triangle cutout. That portion will be matched to your bodice triangle piece later. Now I like to start by matching my wrong sides together and finishing this side seam with a French seam, but feel free to sew and finish the edges of the side of your sleeve however you prefer. A French seam is sewn twice so that the raw edges are basically encased within the seam. You match the wrong sides together, straight stitch, and then fold the fabric so that right sides are now together. Stitch again. This will encase the raw edges, and finally I like to top stitch my seam allowance down. As you can see, the triangle divot remains unsewn. So far, I have added an elastic channel on the top edge of my sleeve and sewn the side of my sleeve together with a French seam. Now let's add another elastic channel to the bottom edge of our sleeve. I am just going to fold this bottom edge over twice, once to hide the raw edge and a second time to create the elastic channel. After folding this edge over 2 times, I'm going to top stitch closely to that folded edge to create the elastic channel. What's important is that you make this elastic channel wide enough to fit your elastic and to leave a small gap unstitched. That way you can insert your elastic. Now we can insert the elastic into the top and bottom edge of your sleeve. I like to start with the bottom edge and feed the elastic through the elastic channel we created. I then pull both sides of the elastic out of the elastic channel, and using a zigzag stitch, I sew the 2 edges of the elastic band together so that the elastic creates a continuous loop within the elastic channel at the bottom of the sleeve. After sewing the elastic together, you can top stitch close the little gap you left open to insert the elastic. The elastic on the top edge of your sleeve is pretty straightforward. Using a bobby pin, I just feed it through the elastic channel, and then I stitch the edges a couple times to secure the elastic to the sleeve. And here is what your sleeves will look like. You can set them aside with your bodice for a moment. We are now going to work on your skirt. Sew the rounded back of your skirt to the pointed front on one side. I just match the pretty sides together, straight stitch, and then finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. At this point, you're going to have 4 pieces which are ready to be combined and assembled into the dress. You're going to have your 2 sleeves, you're going to have your bodice with all of the elastic added, and you're going to have your circle skirt with the front and back joined together at one side seam. Now this next part is a little bit tricky and is a little bit tedious because what we're doing is adding the circle skirt to our bodice. And the reason it's tricky is because of the way we added rows of elastic to create that point on the front of our bodice. That means that our bodice is completely scrunched up. So what we're gonna have to do is stretch out that bottom edge of our bodice and match it to that waist edge on our circle skirt and sew them together. Now I like to stretch and sew directly at the machine, but you might benefit from basting it in advance. It just might be a little bit easier for you. So I'll show you how I do it and let's keep going. I start by matching key points of my skirt to my bodice. I match the center front point of my bodice to the center point on my skirt and pin them together, making sure pretty sides are touching. I also match the seams and center back, pinning these places together as well. Next, I sew the bottom edge of my bodice to the top edge of my skirt. Like I said, this portion can be a bit fiddly, and what I do is I just manually stretch out a few inches of my bodice and then sew it to that skirt edge, just going a little bit at a time, and again making sure that my key places like the center front points match up. And again, all I do is just stretch out the bodice and sew it to the skirt as I go. I repeat this using a zigzag stitch to both reinforce and tidy up the raw edges, stretching and sewing with a zigzag stitch as I go. At this point, this is how your dress should look, mostly assembled except open on one side and in desperate need of some sleeves. So now let's sew the side of your dress together to close it up. Start just beneath that triangle divot, because remember, that is where your sleeve is going to go. It is your armhole. And you're going to sew along that side edge all the way down your bodice and all the way down the side of your skirt. Go very slowly because the bodice portion is very thick and you could break a needle here. So again, go very slowly and just sew the sides of your bodice together and then work your way down the side of the skirt as well. And now finally we can add our sleeves to those little triangle divots that have long been neglected. With pretty sides together, you're going to match your sleeve to the triangle of your bodice. Those two little triangles should fit together pretty perfectly. You might have to do a little easing. And then what you're going to do is just stitch those two edges together and finish them off with a nice zigzag stitch to prevent any fraying. At this point, your dress is basically finished. All that's left to do is hem the bottom edge. But before you start hemming, I recommend you level off the bottom edge of your skirt. To do this, first put your dress on a mannequin or hanger and let the dress hang overnight, or longer if you have the time. Because the skirt portion of this dress is made with a circle skirt, some parts of the skirt have been cut on the bias and will stretch and could warp with time. By hanging it overnight, you allow any stretching that might happen to happen, and now you can use pins to mark where you want to trim your dress and then trim it to the appropriate length and add the hem. I like to add the pins while my dress is still hanging, and that way I can sort of eyeball measure where I want to place the pins so that I know approximately where to cut it. After cutting it, I like to give the bottom edge just a very simple rolled hem, and I just fold it over twice and stitch it down in place. After adding the hem, I decided to make a small decorative bow out of a strip of fabric, and I just hand sewed it to the front of my dress for the finishing touch. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you would like to see other fun DIY videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.